You're listening to Switched On Australia, the podcast that tracks the opportunities and challenges of electrifying everything, everywhere. Switched On is brought to you by the publishers of Renew Economy, Australia's best informed, most read website focusing on the green energy transition, and is supported by Boundless Earth. Boundless Earth uses philanthropy, investment and direct advocacy to help Australia become a global force in a decarbonised world. Hello and welcome to the Switched On Australia podcast. Thanks for joining me. I'm Anne Delaney. Earlier this year, a small grassroots movement of mums, dads and grandparents who fight for real climate solutions because they know their kids will live with the consequences had a major win over one of Australia's energy giants, Energy Australia. Parents for Climate sued the company for misleading claims about its Go Neutral energy product, which it claimed would make your gas and electricity usage carbon neutral. But in an historic settlement, Energy Australia, that's Australia's third largest polluter, was forced to admit that carbon offsets don't undo the harm caused by burning fossil fuels. They had to apologise to more than 400,000 customers for their misleading claims. But the case against Energy Australia wasn't just one company's problem. It exposed deeper flaws in the way the energy sector talks about green products and the way that the government-sanctioned program it was part of, Climate Active, operates. Which is why Parents for Climate have recently produced a new report that raises the stakes again. Their analysis finds that 1 in 3 of Australia's biggest energy retailers are making potentially misleading greenwashing claims, and they've named names. Nic Seton is the CEO for Parents for Climate. Nic Seton, thanks for joining the Switched On podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Nick, when I spoke to you back in May about your win against Energy Australia's carbon neutral claims, you told me that every other company that's undertaking these sorts of claims as part of their decarb strategy will need to review the integrity of their plans and possibly make adjustments. And there were several energy companies who you directed that to. Have Australia's energy companies reviewed the integrity of their plans? Are you aware of anything happening?
Yeah, it looks like things are moving. We ran a survey this year through all of the marketing materials, particularly those available on the energy retailer websites of all the major energy retailers across the country. And we noticed a few things. First, after our successful settlement with Energy Australia, where they effectively capitulated to all of our requests and arguments, we noticed that a lot of the language in the statement by Energy Australia and its apology was being adopted wholesale, verbatim, onto energy retailer websites. And a lot of the claims that were being made previously about carbon neutrality and compensation with offsets, essentially, saying, don't worry about our pollution, we'll pay someone else to do some good work somewhere else. They were being removed. And so we're at a stage now where we've gone from seeing the majority of companies participating in this problematic marketing to a much better situation. There's still a significant amount of what we would consider to be potentially misleading and deceptive conduct. And so we're hoping to see the loophole closed properly, but it's been improving, and that's good. Ultimately, I'm really encouraged, and I encourage those companies to be really proud about being very frank, honest, and active in the reality of their carbon pollution claims.
And that's clearly another win for you guys, for Parents for Climate. But let's name some names. Who are still the major culprits?
Look, we've got some pretty big energy companies out there that are still using this language of carbon neutrality, which is pretty misleading because we know for a fact that consumers don't really understand what's being claimed under this carbon neutral situation. So, for example, AGL, which is one of Australia's biggest and oldest energy companies, promises to sell carbon neutral electricity and gas. And it does so by linking it to the federal government's Climate Active scheme, which offers a carbon neutral certification. But it's actually the actions of that company that it is accountable for its own actions. It can't just defer to a federal government label. it actually has to make clear whether or not it is increasing carbon pollution to its consumers and its customers. And we think that actually is an example of one of the worst offenders, using carbon neutral as spin.
Definitely, given that they actually could be increasing their renewable resources, couldn't they?
Absolutely. I mean, they're in a really strong position to
Mm.
make direct emissions reductions. I know that they have a lot of internal plans and conversations towards that. We just don't think it's appropriate that they then um, compensate for their existing pollution issues with these fairly dubious claims around being somehow neutral by buying so-called offsets that frankly aren't
Mm.
at all equivalent to direct emissions reductions inside the company.
Yeah, as you say, many energy retailers they continue to rely on offsets as part of their marketing claims, and your updated report flags this as a major issue. Can you just unpack why you believe offsets are so problematic in the way they're currently used by retail energy companies?
So there's a lot of issues in offsets, and you don't really need to be like a carbon market expert to understand that at the top level, the issue is that they're being aggregated or used in a way to compensate for existing pollution. And so at best, they might be somehow getting us to a level of like, less pollution overall. At worst, they don't work whatsoever. And they're tricking people into thinking that somehow the pollution that is being created is being effectively dealt with or neutralized or cancelled out or whatever the language that these companies are using somewhere else. And the truth is that study after study has shown that carbon offsets have these fairly significant issues at the heart of the whole concept, which means that, especially in the voluntary carbon market that these energy companies are participating in, it's not rigorous enough to say this is an effective form of climate action. And going back to that top level, what's the issue here? The issue is that while these offsets might be funding some worthwhile projects, they shouldn't be used to compensate existing pollution issues. So if I'm a big energy company creating lots of carbon pollution, I can't just go and, back a wind farm in India somewhere that probably would have been built anyway and say that my problem is gone. The pollution's still there and it's still causing havoc.
Yeah, or pay for not chopping down a forest that was never going to be chopped down in the first place.
Absolutely. So you've got the issue of additionality with the wind farm, like whether or not it would have happened anyway. You've got the
Mm.
issue of leakage. If you say, "Oh, I'm going to stop you from paying, I'll pay you to not cut down that forest," and the loggers are like, "All right, take the money and just go to another forest." You've got the issue of permanence, where the forest that you paid for to be protected burns down in a bushfire because climate change is getting worse, and so it didn't last very long. And then you've got the issue of, whether or not these things are like mixing up avoidance and carbon drawdown. So, for example, some companies are claiming that the wind farm avoids some emissions, whereas other companies are claiming the forest actually draws down emissions into the negative, and that they're somehow both equivalent carbon credits, as if they are all aggregated into one big soup. All of these projects with all of the detail and all of the nuance somehow gets traded as if they're just shares in a stock market.
Mm.
That's just not how nature works. It's very complicated. And in
Yeah.
reality, what we'd like to see is just don't use them for compensation. You can invest in worthwhile projects. That's great. Pat on the back. But don't use it to trick people into thinking your pollution is somehow absolved.
So using them to support some positive impact without making those carbon neutral claims, that's different and defensible.
That's right. I mean, the key word I think is contribution. If a company wants to make a contribution to worthwhile projects, like forest protection and so on, fantastic. Don't use compensation, where you're actually saying somehow your emissions in aggregate are somehow back to zero or in the negative or whatever false claim is being made. Because if you're increasing pollution whilst also paying for these worthwhile projects, the amount of pollution in the atmosphere is still increasing. And so
Mm.
misleading consumers into thinking this is somehow effective, this is somehow enough. And, we zoom right out here. And what we're really talking about is a lot of the logic behind net zero and a lot of, the Australian government approaches to climate action in the international conversation. I mean, we've got some big systemic conversations to address around these dubious approaches and structures in dealing with climate. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what we need to see is as many projects as possible that can remove carbon go forward, and as many projects that are producing carbon decrease and stop producing carbon. And those two things need to happen, but they also need to be kept separate because they're not equivalent. You can't just say you plant a tree and therefore the energy use is clean and green. That just doesn't work in reality.
Yeah.
The pollution's there and it's hurting people.
Nick, what have some of the Energy Australia consumers said to you in response to the case that you ran against Energy Australia?
After the case, we had so many people writing in saying, I've just received this apology. I'd never heard of you guys before, but I thought this was, absolutely the best I could do on a climate front. And I feel absolutely let down. And all of these mums and dads and grandparents out there who are like, look, thank you, but also I feel bad. Like it's a horrible thing for someone to feel like they've been misled or duped. And we were absolutely surprised, that there's so many people took it upon themselves to write to us, and the degree to which people were feeling frustrated that this could happen. And when we surveyed beyond that so many other companies' customers were experiencing the same thing. And it's not just energy. Probably the most common example of greenwashing suspicion is when someone may be purchasing an airline ticket from a company like Qantas and being told that the offset cost to, completely eradicate the guilt that they might have from their flight is, maybe a few bucks or something really inconsistent with people's understanding of the challenge. And I think that, Qantas has been called out and they are using better language on their website, but at the end of the day, to make these compensatory claims is cunning, if not misleading, because you're deliberately playing on the concerns and the guilt that mums and dads have when they're thinking about what the best they can do for their family looks like. And really, they need to be empowered with honest information. So yes, contributory claims, absolutely. That's probably the best way forward. And unfortunately, a lot of these mums and dads who are just really upset and fuming about these claims being made and revealed, they should have been treated fairly in the first place.
And just distrustful of our corporations, essentially.
Yes, absolutely. Trust is breaking down. We see that across lots of different analyses. This is an area where it could easily be restored. And so if we want to see the social license for climate action increase, and if we want to see carbon reduction actually happen company by company, this needs to be sorted out.
Your most recent report, which you very cheekily called the Climate Nonsense Report, has found that over 1 in 3 major Australian energy retailers are at risk of making misleading greenwashing claims. Just tell me, is this a legal risk or a reputational risk or both?
In our opinion, it's both. So based on the arguments that we launched against Energy Australia in the federal court, and ultimately were really successful in reaching a very productive settlement with Energy Australia on those matters. When we apply those arguments to what we see on other energy companies' websites this year, this is what we found. And so we think it's a real legal risk. Ultimately, it's for the court to decide whether these companies are misleading and deceiving their consumers, but we think that that's a real risk they need to pay attention to, and one that, their boards and their shareholders should be alive to, because it's just not worth it. It's 2025. We now know that, offsets have issues, and we shouldn't be hiding behind, the herd or some kind of dodgy label to try and, not get noticed and trick other people into buying our products. And now we're seeing a lot of movement. So in the last 6 months, as I mentioned, a lot of these energy companies have changed the language on their website. They've removed a lot of their offset and carbon neutral products. And that's really positive. I think what we're starting to see is essentially a lot of self-policing, which, that's good. They are accountable for their actions. But there's still a few who are still using this language in a way that's a bit too loosey-goosey, particularly around carbon neutrality. I mean, if you look at other markets like in the EU, the EU Green Claims Directive effectively bans this type of carbon neutral claims tied to offsets. it's not good enough for Europe to have these labels and claims being perpetuated to their consumers. It shouldn't really apply in Australia either, or anywhere for that matter, because it's misleading, it's dodgy, and it's not very scientific. It's like sticking on a green label because you said so, rather than having a scientist actually come in and validate that. I think a lot of the arguments around the carbon credit effectiveness and so on will go on for some time. But as we say, that's a contribution companies can make. It shouldn't be a compensation for their pollution, which, at best is not really doing enough on climate. And at worst, it's just a license to pollute, business as usual.
I wanted to know more about the EU Green Claims Directive. When did that come in, and how enforceable is that?
It's very enforceable, but it has to be interpreted through the nation states' laws. So each EU member has to figure out how they're going to do that domestically. I believe it's now enshrined, so ratified and active. It's been a few years in the making,
Mm.
and it's quite a broad directive. It covers a lot of areas, but one of the areas is around these green labels and eco claims that don't really have much behind them. They don't have any kind of explanation or backing. And carbon neutral claims is one of those spaces. And it's actually played out where, for example, KLM, the airline in the Netherlands, was making these kind of carbon neutral claims and ultimately lost a court case. They were essentially claiming that they had CO2 neutral flights, and there were environment groups in the Netherlands who launched legal action against that airline, and that case was happening at the same time as ours, saying that its marketing misled consumers into believing that their flights had no climate impact because it's being called CO2 neutral. And there was a lot of skepticism and a lot of attention on this case, and the Green Claims Directive in the EU was being developed around the same time. So I think this is an example of where different types of advocacy are happening in different fora. So the Amsterdam District Court found that the airline's claims around its commitment to the Paris Agreement and its aims to achieve net zero, its emissions and so on, were too optimistic and therefore misleading, particularly given the amount of decarbonisation measures it was actually undertaking, which were much less than what would have been necessary to make any of that very credible. And so it really set a precedent for companies that were making these unsubstantiated net zero promises, and particularly for all of the PR in that space as well, based on these so-called CO2 neutral flights.
And it does raise the issue of, I suppose, punishments and enforceability of some of these bans, like the EU Green Claims Directive. I mean, surely we need ways to enforce bans like that, rather than leaving it up to small voluntary groups to be be picking up on what big corporations are doing.
Yeah, I agree. Yes, well, I'd like to see that. I'd like to see the regulator being effectively empowered and supported. In our case, that's the ACCC. They have provided some guidance on environmental sustainability claims, but it's very broad and it's very open to interpretation and not effectively policed. And so, we're in a situation where in Australia, a company can make a lot of green claims, which is just greenwashing, particularly on climate pollution, and not really face serious consequences. So we engaged Energy Australia. We spoke to our supporters and found out that a lot of the customers of Energy Australia were very confused by this product. We engaged the company and actually asked them to do something about it. And we engaged the federal government on its climate active certification. And no one really wanted to budge. So we took it into our own hands and took action on behalf of our community and our kids, because ultimately we were really concerned that consumers were just being hoodwinked. Here we are, a couple of years later, with a great court outcome, and now we're applying the same argument to other companies. We've written to a lot of these companies now, making it clear where we think they have room for improvement, but we still don't have effective enforcement. And I'm really concerned that this issue could continue to get worse. We know that the government's indicating that it will improve its climate active scheme, and it really needs an overhaul, because while it's continuing, and I can't believe that it's being grandfathered at the moment when they know they're going to need to overhaul. Like, they should stop certifying carbon neutral claims. It's
Are they
just,
still actually certifying?
as far as I know, that has not stopped. Whether they're getting many customers these days in that particular scheme, I don't know, because it looks like a lot of brands are departing that scheme in droves, partly
Yeah.
for a lack of confidence and partly because it's just not being seen as credible by the marketplace. And that's a really missed opportunity. I don't want to see, everything being shut down. We're not trying to say no to all of these things. We're trying to create a level of scrutiny and honesty and integrity that will be effective. We need to deal with climate change. We don't want to see climate active trashed. We want to see it made effective.
Yes.
And I think that's what the government wants too. But
And just to clarify, the Climate Active program, I mean, I checked the website this morning. There are still, I think, 490 odd companies that have signed up to this program, and it's a government-backed certification scheme that has, well, I mean, I think as you put it to me in the last time that we spoke, it's enabled years of misleading green claims, and it provides a government tick for these carbon neutral claims. I think you called it state-sponsored greenwashing, didn't you?
essentially, yeah, it is a form of state-sponsored greenwashing, because we know a lot of these claims are baseless and misleading and greenwashing. And while the state continues to hand out these badges of honor that essentially call themselves carbon neutral certification, that's pretty dodgy. The government knows this. They've announced the review. It's just been a long time coming. It's been over 3 years now since the previous Assistant Minister, Jenny McAllister, made it very clear that they were looking to ditch this carbon neutral loophole and improve the rigor and require genuine emissions reductions plans for this scheme. And we're still waiting for that conclusion. And in that time, we've had years of hundreds of companies participating in years of increased emissions, and lots of companies benefiting from the glow of federal government endorsed green label activity while producing much more pollution. And a lot of these companies, I think, are participating in good faith. They're trying to follow the rules. They're trying to maintain best practice. It's high time the government made it clear what best practice actually looks like.
Mm.
Yeah, it's not fair on the companies. Like, the bad guy here is pollution. We can all address that issue and work on that and get it down to a level that's safe and effective and conducive to a safe climate for our kids who are growing up with worsening conditions.
So you don't think the Climate Active program should be scrapped? Is it better enforcement? Is it the governance, the auditing process, the enforcement mechanisms that are inadequate? Where's the weak point, do you think, that really needs to be reviewed and amended?
Essentially, we are seeing companies participate in the scheme with offsetting and so-called compensatory claims, when what we really need to see is genuine emissions reductions. And so the incentive's in the wrong place. We've got a system where, unfortunately, people are buying carbon credits because they think that's the most efficient way to participate in climate action. And if it's not effective, and if it's not able to be used to compensate, then what we really need to see is proper incentivization and rewards for genuine emissions reductions. Companies that are reducing their emissions need to be recognized for that. And I think that's where the Climate Active scheme could play a role, is actually saying, you want to take voluntary action? We'll back you, we'll give you a framework, and we'll show you, we'll platform you for doing the right thing. That's good stuff. That's what we need to see. And I think the federal government has a fantastic role to play there, but being very high integrity about it. At the moment, it feels like the Wild West, and consumers are not empowered and not supported and not protected. And everyone who participates in the market is losing out, because the people who are doing the right thing are competing with people who aren't. And so it's very unfair. Overall, pollution continues and goes up, and consumers who think they're buying the right thing and executing their consumer choice are being misled. And yeah, the whole thing sucks.
Yes.
So it needs overhaul.
But
But
does
we
that
don't want to ditch it, because if we ditch it, the government's sort of just dropping it in the too hard basket, which, is frankly, that's not what we need. We need a government that's taking things seriously and dealing with the hard questions.
But does that high integrity that you refer to that's needed in a program like this, does that, again, I'm coming back to, the issues of enforcement, maybe not voluntary, but then you have a whole extra level of monitoring. Is that what it's going to take to deliver that high integrity?
I think at the end of the day, we need clarity about what plain language disclosure of pollution looks like
Mm.
so that customers know what are they buying. Because when you buy something and it's got all this stuff on the tin label, you expect the contents to match. And right now, that's not really what's happening in the energy retailer space or in a lot of those places where carbon neutrality is being claimed. And that's really, it's not good enough. So at the basic level, we need to see that clarity and standard being more clearly articulated. And I think that means empowering the regulator, the ACCC, to be able to really do that, to make it really clear. I know they have limited resources and they have a lot of attention on greenwashing. I would like to see them being supported to effectively make clear that mixing up, carbon credits with pollution issues is not at all plain language honesty. That is potentially misleading and deceptive and needs to be stopped.
So, yes, I mean, the ACCC, the regulator, already provides guidance on what businesses must comply with under Australian consumer law when making their environmental and sustainability claims. You're suggesting that that may not be strong enough as it exists currently, that guidance, and it potentially needs better enforcement again?
Yeah, I think so. I think at the moment we've got some guidance which boils down to don't make unsubstantiated claims. Don't
Mm.
claim stuff without making it clear what evidence you're using to base those claims on. But it hasn't gone far enough to say, can, you know, actions over here equate to, pollution over there? And that's where I think we've got this compensation claim problem, which needs to be clarified and sorted out. I think the ACCC is in the perfect position to be able to do that. We're seeing that happen in other jurisdictions like in the EU. So ultimately, I want to make sure that, when a consumer or a household is making a purchasing decision, the information that they're reading is the best possible standard and that they have that choice. They're empowered to be able to make that decision themselves and supported to make a really pro climate positive decision so that they're not just being given clear information about pollution, but they're also being given clear signposts towards how they can reduce their pollution.
Mm.
That can all be made very explicit and clear by the ACCC. However, it also needs to be government-wide, and we need to see the climate active scheme catch up too. We can't wait another 3 years for this scheme to stop making these claims somehow safe for companies to participate in. They've got to sort that out. It's been long enough. The department's been working on the detail. I'm sure it's complicated, but it doesn't mean they've got a free pass to sit on this forever.
Yeah, 3 years is a long time. Do you have any insight into why it's taking so long?
We've heard lots of different things, and I'm sure there's 1,000 excuses out there. The examples we've been given are like, oh, maybe there's a brand that has been writing this certification into its contracts with overseas buyers, and that creates a risk if the certification scheme was to change. Well, sure, but that could be grandfathered, or that could be given an end date, or that could be, essentially set into, previous certification, or something that just essentially mitigates those risks. So ultimately, we're not buying it. We're not really clear as to why the federal government won't bite the bullet here and just clarify things. There is a broader system level issue where Australia is effectively enabling offsetting as a form of climate action through both the safeguard mechanism and through our own participation in the way the Paris Agreement actually enables these nature-based offsets and biotic stores to be, confused with burning coal and gas and oil. that is a problem too. But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, as an organization that represents families who consume all sorts of products, like that's where we're coming in and saying, well, our standing is as the consumer, and this level of deception is way too high. We need to clamp it down. We've made it really clear. No one's disagreeing with us. This is the funny thing. We're hearing from Labor, federal government, from the department. Everyone agrees that, yeah, you've made a great point. We'll sort that out. It's just not happening. And I think that's where we're seeing this kind of effective climate inaction through delay and through obfuscation. And that's not good enough either. And it just doesn't pass the test. I think a lot of families in Australia at the moment are starting to realize that while the government talks a big game on climate, it's still not actually tackling the ball here. Like it's not actually dealing with the key issue of increasing pollution. And that's what this scheme is enabling. And unless it starts rewarding decreasing pollution and making things better, and we use a phrase in Parents for Climate, which is a kids test, because kids don't go to the pub. We don't have the pubs test. If they are in the pub, they're not allowed to participate fully. So we have a kids test, and the kids test is basically, are kids better off overall?
Yeah.
And under the Climate Active, they are not. And so it does not pass. It is not good enough for the next generation for us to be perpetuating these dodgy claims that frankly aren't based in credible science. And everyone agrees. So look, it is frustrating. You can hear it in my tone.
Yes, just get on with it.
Yeah, and we're leaning onto it. So, and that's why we pulled this out. We said, look, we'll do a survey of all these companies and we'll show how many companies could be sued. And you know what? If you're out there, I mean, it was a big effort for us to undertake that lawsuit. It's not easy to sue an energy giant. I appreciate that. But if there's another party out there that wants to give this a bit of scrutiny, go for it. We don't own it. And you could apply this in the federal court because, frankly, these companies need to be held to account and their legal risk is real. And we can see in other jurisdictions that these court cases are being won or settled in favor of people who want greater climate action. And so we're just pointing it out. In fact, we're giving you the names list.
It's on a platter. Somebody do it. Yeah.
Well, yes, if the government won't do it, unfortunately, we have to take it into our own hands.
Yeah. Look, just a final question. That issue about consumer trust that you've raised is so crucial for the energy transition. And I know that you've surveyed parents, and what's come up is that, a lot of people feel that the government needs stricter regulation around claims. And I've interviewed a very interesting professor, Professor Sarah Bice. She says that the main driver for trust about infrastructure projects, for instance, is regulation. That people have to believe that there is strong regulation that is the safety net, that it's going to protect us. There seems to be, just overall, what's happening at the moment in terms of the transition, there seems to be a bit of a gap between policy/regulation and public sentiment. Would you agree with something like that?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. And it's getting worse. So when we surveyed around 500 parents at the start of this year, what they reported back to us was that 90% of them think that greenwashing from household providers like energy companies and banks, it's getting worse. If 9 out of 10 people think it's getting worse year on year, like it really indicates a slippage of public trust and confidence in not just regulations, but in governments to actually be doing their jobs here. Nearly the same number believe that these companies need to be held more accountable and feel strongly that the government really needs to create stricter regulations around these sustainability claims. And so many of them were saying that not only do they think they've experienced greenwashing, but that they are taking action on it as well. So a lot of these companies really need to sort of do their own analysis here, because if companies are being, if people are experiencing the claims of these companies and feeling like there's no one they can trust, they're actually making decisions proactively or defensively to get out of these situations. So whether it's energy companies, banking, insurance, and so on, a lot of our supporters are saying they're actively departing those brands or moving elsewhere because they're concerned about greenwashing, because they think they've experienced it or that it might be something that company is perpetuating elsewhere. So it's just, I don't know. It's frustrating because I think it's something that at the end of the day, if the greater public understood how many of them agreed on this point, then it would probably just start to look blindingly obvious that it's been long overdue and is very easy to solve on behalf of the Australian public at large. And I think it's something that, the ACCC chair has indicated is a priority. I just think they need the resources and the license to do something about it.
Yes.
So I don't think they've been asleep on the job, not at all. I just think that it's a big job because there's a lot of companies out there who are doing this. And so, I would like to see some strong action and at least, at a bare minimum, very explicit guidance as to what is and is not high integrity and honest claims.
Well, let's hope regulators, government, industry have been listening to you, Nick. Nic Seton, thanks so much for joining the Switched On podcast today.
Oh, look, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
And Nic Seton is the CEO of Parents for Climate. You can read their full report on greenwashing by Australia's major energy retailers, along with their recommendations for fixing the climate active framework on the Parents for Climate website. Thanks for listening today. Don't forget to follow Switched On Australia wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what we do, please tell all your friends. In fact, just tell everyone you know. I'm Anne Delaney. See you next time.